All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy, and I'm the Communications Manager at the Archives Partnership Trust. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to spotlight the life and legacy of Frances Perkins. Our summer 2025 issue of New York Archives magazine features a powerful article about the new statue honoring her in Ithaca, New York. We're also honored to welcome today's speaker, Mary Reid, from the Francis Perkins Center in Newcastle, Maine. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce New York Archives Magazine, our award-winning publication that brings history to life through the remarkable stories uncovered in archives across the state. New York Archives is a quarterly educational publication that shares compelling stories drawn from historical records from the state archives and other organizations across the state that hold historical records. Each issue features engaging articles on New York's rich and diverse history, from lesser known stories to new perspectives on familiar events. Whether you're a historian, educator, student, or just someone who loves learning about the past, our magazine offers something for everyone. New York Archives is produced by the New York Archives Partnership Trust and funded through subscription support, grants, and donors to the trust. In 2023, we introduced New York Archives Junior for our younger readers in grades 4 through 8. Through subscription and donor support, we are able to offer educators and students free copies. Since spring of last year, over 260,000 juniors have been distributed to schools in 55 counties. We will share all relevant links, including our editorial guidelines, subscription page, and our online speaker series after the presentation. If you're already a subscriber or supporter, thank you. Consider sharing New York Archives and the Junior Edition with a friend, colleague, or local library. If you are interested in pitching an article or planning an event with us, please email us at aptrust@nysed.gov. We will also be sharing relevant links from the Francis Perkins Center in that email as well. Now I would like to formally introduce our speaker today, Mary Reid. Mary Reid joined the Francis Perkins Center in 2024. She is currently the Programs and Partnership Coordinator at the organization. She double majored in history and biology at Bard College, graduating in 2021. She earned an MPhil in early modern history from Trinity College Dublin, focusing on gender and the history of science. Reid was born and raised in Edgecombe and has experience working, interning, and researching in nonprofit and academic settings. We're excited to continue sharing the stories that make New York's history so unique. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, be sure to type them in our Q&A box at the bottom, and we will get to as many as possible at the end. Thank you for your support and enjoy the rest of today's program. Thank you.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Like Amy said, I am the Programs and Partnerships Coordinator here at the Francis Perkins Center. I'm actually right here in Newcastle, Maine at the moment in the homestead. And I'm super excited to be talking with you today about the life and legacy of Frances Perkins. So most of my slides will not have this much information on them, but I like to give a brief overview of who we are, go over our mission, and what we're doing right now. So the Francis Perkins Center inspires current and future generations to understand and uphold the government's role in providing social justice and economic security for all. Our work is guided by Frances Perkins's effective leadership style and one woman's power to change the world. We are also now the official philanthropic partner with the National Park Service to support projects and programs at the Frances Perkins Monument site here in Newcastle. So I'll talk a little bit more about the organization at the end, but that's just a quick overview for now. And I also like to give a quick overview of who Frances Perkins was, because if you're like me, maybe you've heard her name, but prior to working at the Francis Perkins Center, I personally didn't really know a lot about her, unfortunately. So she was the US Secretary of Labor for Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the entirety of his presidency from 1933 to 1945. She was also the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, and she was, although most people don't know this, the architect of Social Security a minimum wage, unemployment insurance, a 40-hour work week, bans on child labor, and many of the worker and fire safety standards we kind of take for granted today. And that's honestly just kind of scraping the surface of her many accomplishments. And after this presentation, if you're interested in delving more into her life, I really encourage that you read more about her because there's just so much to her story, and I'll do my best to do it justice within these 45 minutes. So now that we have that out of the way, we're going to start right at the beginning with her origins. She was actually not born Frances Perkins. She was born Fanny Corley Perkins in 1880 in Boston, Massachusetts. And she wouldn't actually change her name until later in life, but I will refer to her as Frances Perkins throughout, as she would have wanted. And though she grew up in Massachusetts, she has her roots in Maine. Her mother, Susan E. Bean, came from Bethel, Maine, and her father, Frederick Perkins, was born and raised in Newcastle on land along the Damascotta River, where his ancestors first settled in the 1750s. The family farmed the land here and also operated a brickyard. And you can see the house that I'm in right now on the right, next to the photo of Frances Perkins as a child. And if you actually go to the homestead today, you can see the bricks along the Damascotta River, which is pretty cool. So they made the house out of their own bricks. The brickyard, unfortunately, began to falter towards the end of the 19th century. And this was due to larger companies popping up in the area. And when Frederick and Susan first married, they actually operated a dairy farm here at the homestead instead. Susan was really talented with animal husbandry, but that wasn't really the life that Frederick wanted for his family. So he and his younger brother moved to Massachusetts for better prospects. Frances ended up being born in Boston, as I've said, and they ended up moving to Worcester in the end. And that's where they were successful. They opened a paper goods store that's actually open to this day. The Perkins family household, it's interesting to set the scene for the environment she grew up in. It was actually fairly strict and conservative in a lot of ways. She and her younger sister, Ethel, who was 4 years her junior, were often just sheltered to the school, the home, and the nearby Plymouth Congregational Church. So they were really in this bubble throughout their childhood, but Frances Perkins was inquisitive from a young age, and when she encountered poverty, she would ask why people were poor. She would ask her family, and they would often give the accepted answers of the day, that it was due to alcoholism or laziness, but that didn't really sit right with her. Her family didn't really encourage this line of thought, though. They didn't think that a young girl should be thinking about these things. Frederick Perkins, however, did have some more progressive ideas. He believed that she should have an education, and he actually taught her Greek grammar from a really young age and read her a lot of classics, and really just encouraged that side of her intellectualism, which would definitely play a role later down the line when she went to school and was a very successful student. But he encouraged that side of her, and it was always assumed that she would end up attending college. She ended up going to Worcester's Classical High School, and then she enrolled in Mount Holyoke College, about 50 miles away in South Hadley, Massachusetts. However, going back a little bit, I do want to talk a little bit more about Maine, because that's where I am and that's where we are located. And just emphasize that she did really maintain, or her family maintained, ties to Maine throughout their life, really. Frequently in the winters, her uncle would come and stay, and also her grandmother, who is pictured right here on the right. And she also would spend her summers at the homestead. And I can really imagine this as being a very idyllic place to have your childhood. It's a gorgeous property, and she was really, really close with her grandmother, Cynthia Otis Perkins. She would have been a widow in her 70s at the time of Frances' childhood, and Frances later explained, quote, "I am extraordinarily the product of my grandmother," and Cynthia's guidance and wisdom really stayed with her throughout her life. And one of the sort of famous pieces of these wisdom, or at least famous amongst the Frances Perkins Center, is when a door opens to you, you must walk through it. Cynthia was incredibly self-reliant, and like I said, these values that she taught Frances Perkins from a young age really went with her all the way to Washington. Frances Perkins actually ended up inheriting the land here and the house in 1927 and owned it until her death in 1965. And she's actually buried less than a mile away down the road in Glidden Cemetery. So we'll talk a little bit more about the property later, but on to the next chapter. So Mount Holyoke College. So Mount Holyoke College is the nation's oldest continuing institution of higher education for women. It was founded in 1837 by Mary Lyon, and Mary Lyon really believed that education was, quote, education was fit to do one good. So it came with a responsibility. So Mount Holyoke College was not necessarily intended to be a place where wealthy young women would go and sort of become ornaments to society with their educations. That, of course, became what happened to some of these young women because it was not encouraged to take their education farther than undergrad. I was often encouraged that they would get married. But Frances Perkins really took that message to heart, and she thrived at Mount Holyoke. Her classmates called her Perk. She took incredibly rigorous courses. She actually studied physics and chemistry, which is kind of surprising, but she had many, many different intellectual interests. She probably could have been successful in many different fields. She was also a class president upon graduation, and she was valedictorian. But it was really in her final semester that she had sort of life-changing experiences at Mount Holyoke. She took this class on English and American industrialism taught by Professor Anna May Soule, and it tracked the growth of industrialism in England and the US sort of throughout the course of history. And it also required that students go and visit mills along the Connecticut River to see the working conditions. And this really brought Frances Perkins out of her bubble. And she said, quote, "From the time I was in college, I was horrified at the work that many women and children had to do in factories. There were absolutely no effective laws that regulated the number of hours they were permitted to work." They actually ended up starting a chapter of the National Consumers League, and in February of 1902, its executive secretary, Florence Kelley, came to speak. And this speech also had a long effect on Frances Perkins and, quote, "first opened my mind to the necessity for and the possibility of the work which became my life's vocation." The graduating class motto for Mount Holyoke for that year was "Be ye steadfast." And again, that's another thing that Perkins carried with her throughout her life, I think. So, on to the next chapter. After she graduated Mount Holyoke, she sort of experienced this brief period of time where she wasn't sure what to do, as a lot of people do after undergrad. But this was, of course, sort of worsened by the fact that her family really expected her to just get married, maybe work at the church, or do something that was more accepted at the time. But Frances Perkins saw other things for herself. She began to run a club for teenage girls in the area who were working in factories. And one of the girls, named Mary Hogan, actually came back one day from work, and her hand had been cut off by the machinery at a candy factory she had worked in. And Frances was enraged by this because she had just been sent home with a bandage, essentially. She rallied support to get some money for her, but she really began to see that although social work and charity was a wonderful vocation, it wouldn't necessarily change the larger structural issues in the country that allowed things like this to happen. She eventually left Worcester and she began to teach at Ferry Hall in Lake Forest, Illinois. It was an elite girls' school. And around this time, she also changed her religious affiliation from the Congregational Church of her family, and she became Episcopalian around 1905. And she would remain really quite religious throughout her life, and she would turn to her faith in times of personal or professional difficulty. It was also around this time where she changed her name from Fanny to Frances, which you'll notice when said aloud is gender neutral. I'm sure that was intentional. She wanted to be taken more seriously. And in Illinois, she also spent a lot of her free time and her vacations working at settlement houses such as Jane Addams' Hull House, where she did work directly with Jane Addams. And she got the opportunity to see poverty more up close, to see the effects of unemployment on people. And uh, again, this really just opened her eyes more. So this was really a time of personal change for her and a time of gaining her independence, moving so far away from home and doing all of these things. In 1907, another great change happened in her life where she ended up moving to Philadelphia and became the inaugural general secretary of the Philadelphia Research and Protective Association. And this was a new organization whose goal was to thwart the diversion of newly arrived immigrant girls from the South into prostitution and sex trafficking. So this was really, really challenging work, but it really put her on the front lines once again, bringing her out of this sort of upper middle class upbringing that she had in Worcester. So in 1909, she decided that she wanted to make another change. She had always wanted to go to New York City and work there, and she actually started a fellowship with the New York School of Philanthropy investigating childhood malnutrition among school children in New York's Hell's Kitchen. And she enrolled in a master's degree at Columbia University to study sociology and economics. So she's constantly educating herself. She's constantly trying to learn more in these areas that she is stepping into that she might not have necessarily been educated on previously. And then in 1910, she actually became the executive secretary of the New York Consumers League. And she worked closely with Florence Kelley, who I mentioned previously, who gave that speech that inspired her so much. And she was mainly working on sanitary regulations for bakeries, fire protections for factories, and legislation to limit the working hours for women and children. And she helped to pass a bill that limited working hours for women and children in factories to 54 hours per week in New York State. Much of her time was spent in Albany in the halls and committee rooms of the state capitol. And she made a lot of allies there, such as Al Smith and a few others. But this was a really challenging time because this was really, if we're thinking about sort of the scope of her life up to this point, she's been surrounded by a lot of women. She had her grandmother who was so inspirational to her as a child and beyond. She went to an all-women's college. She has people around her like Jane Addams and Florence Kelley. So she's now in these places where she is often one of the only women, if not the only woman. And she is incredibly observant. So she starts taking notes on how male colleagues perceive her. And she has a good sense of humor. So she titles it something like Notes on the Male Mind. And she perceived that men were often less threatened by their mothers. So once incredibly fashionable for her time, she actually started changing the way that she dressed. She wore more of her kind of iconic matronly dresses with the strand of pearls, and then came her tricorn hat, which was very, very outdated for the time. This took a lot of social and self-awareness and an ability to navigate existing gender roles that she was aware of. So a little unfortunate that she sort of felt the need to do that, but she was incredibly savvy and smart and knew what had to be done for change to happen. So this, again, was already very transformative time, but an event happened in 1911 that would really change the course and the trajectory of her entire career and change the way that she thought about her career. So on March 25th, 1911, she was having tea with friends in New York City's Washington Square when the group heard fire engines. And running to the scene of the fire, Frances Perkins actually witnessed in horror as about 47 workers, most of them young immigrant women, jumped to their deaths from this factory building. The firefighters' ladders were not tall enough, and in total, about 146 people died in the fire. And you've probably heard of this fire, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. A lot of people don't know that she was actually an eyewitness to this. The deaths were mostly to blame, however, on the factory owner, if not completely to blame, because there were no fire safety measures in place, and all of the doors had been locked except for one because he believed that the workers would steal otherwise and wanted to be able to check their bags when they left. So all of the entrances were engulfed in flames, and there was no way out. And this was, of course, incredibly traumatizing for Frances Perkins to witness something like this, but it really changed how she thought about things, and she eventually would quit her job at the New York Consumers League and join the investigating organization that looked into this fire. So moving on to specifically her time in New York State and her rise in politics there after the fire. So during this period of time, in the 1910s and 20s, this really shows her trajectory up towards the position of Secretary of Labor. So she left her job at the Consumers League, and in response to the fire, a Citizens Committee on Safety was established to recommend practices to prevent future fires like this. And at the suggestion of actually Theodore Roosevelt, who was familiar with her work with the Consumers League, she was hired as the group's executive secretary. So she was the leader of this group. And one of the committee's first actions was to make a state commission to investigate and make legislative recommendations to prevent these things from happening. And then the goal of the organization actually expanded, not just to look at fire safety, but other threats to health and well-being of industrial workers and the impact upon their families. Frances Perkins, by that time, was a recognized expert in the field. And, from her master's degree to her work with the Consumers League and everything that came up to that. So she was known as a person, known well enough to be recognized by Theodore Roosevelt. And so she was trusted to lead this commission. And it actually resulted in probably the most comprehensive set of laws governing workplace health and safety in the nation to this point. And then these laws, a lot of the sort of fire safety laws we know today that started in New York State, then became the model for other states and federal level. So reflecting on these years as lobbyist, investigator, and researcher, Frances Perkins later said, the extent to which the legislation in New York marked a change in American political attitudes and policies towards social responsibility can scarcely be overstated. It was, I'm convinced, a turning point. So we'll talk a little bit about Frances Perkins's personal life here in a moment during this time, but I just want to continue her rise in New York State politics. The election for New York State governor in 1918 was the first in which women could vote. They, of course, wouldn't have the federal right to vote for a couple years, but Frances Perkins campaigned hard to capture the women's vote, in particular for Al Smith, who had been her ally. And once he won, she was appointed to the New York State Industrial Commission and was the first woman to be appointed to an administrative position in New York State government. And Smith's goal was to weed out the incompetence and corruption in the state labor department so that Frances and her fellow commissioners would enforce the laws the Factory Investigating Commission had brought about. During his 4 terms, Frances Perkins really served as the closest labor advisor that he had, and then he actually appointed her to be the chair of the Industrial Commission in 1926. She was then traveling around the country to support his presidential campaign, and she was also at that time supporting FDR in his campaign to become the next governor of New York. So it's important to acknowledge how just is she so successful during this time. You almost have to pause for a moment and remember how monumental all of these steps would have been for a woman to be in these increasing positions of power when she wouldn't have even been able to vote in the previous decade. And this success sort of continued, although Smith lost the presidential election of 1928. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did win the election to become governor, and he appointed Frances Perkins to become the inaugural New York State Industrial Commissioner with oversight responsibilities over the entire labor department. So she soon became the most prominent, really, state labor official in the entire nation at that point. And she and Roosevelt searched for ways to deal with rising unemployment because, of course, in October 1929, the stock market crash happened and the onset of the Great Depression, the rapid rise in unemployment and poverty. She knew immediately that she needed to persuade Roosevelt to allow her to introduce policies and programs that would be sustainable at a state level to directly help those in need. She was also at this time challenging the Hoover administration's prediction in January of 1930 that employment was on the rise and recovery from the Depression was in sight. She was really angry at this because she saw it as a deception. And she actually called a press conference and announced that Hoover was wrong. And she specifically went to the New York Bureau of Labor Statistics and got the data, got the facts, and showed that there was a steady decline in employment, with January's unemployment slated to be the worst in 16 years. Her confrontation made the front page, and the Hoover administration tried to make reassuring statements, but she would just keep on countering with statistical evidence. So with her encouragement, Roosevelt really became the first public official in the country to commit himself to unemployment insurance. And in 1930, he sent her to England to study the British system so that she could come back with a version that might work for Americans. All right. So I do want to briefly talk about her personal life. I feel like it would be an injustice not to mention what was going on during this time in the background. A lot of people assume she wasn't married because she kept her family name, but she actually did marry Paul Wilson, and they met in 1910. He was from a wealthy merchant family and was working as a financial statistician at a nonprofit organization. They began as friends and correspondents before starting a romantic relationship, and they were very, very happy together initially. They got married in 1913, and Paul was working on John Perroy Mitchell's campaign to become New York City mayor. It was successful, and they were running in similar social circles, and were initially very happy. She did keep her name, as I mentioned, and this was very, very controversial for the time, and she faced a lot of backlash for that. She and Paul prospered in New York City specifically, but life kind of started to take a turn in 1915. His career began to sort of occupy more time, and Frances Perkins took a role in their highly regimented household, running all of those ongoings, and it became kind of taxing for her. And then, unfortunately, she found out he was having an affair and she planned to leave him. She then found out she was pregnant and remained in the marriage. She experienced a miscarriage of her first pregnancy, and her second pregnancy after that She had developed preeclampsia, a really dangerous condition, and her child ended up being stillborn. She gave birth to her daughter, Susanna, on December 30th, 1916. Susanna would be her only child. And their marriage was momentarily improved, but things took a turn again. Paul was sort of exhibiting signs of mental illness. He was drinking excessively. He lost his inheritance. He also lost his job when John Perroy Mitchell lost the next election. So he had what historians believe was likely bipolar disorder, which of course would have been incredibly misunderstood at the time. And he was in and out of sanitariums for the rest of his life. So she became the breadwinner of the family. And she, of course, was already employed, but this put an extra pressure on things. Susanna would experience similar issues later in life with her mental health, and they had a very difficult relationship. Susanna would have one child, Tomlin, who would learn about Frances Perkins' accomplishments later in life and ended up being one of the founders of the Frances Perkins Center here. And he would dedicate a lot of his life to making her story known. So she has a rather sad personal story, but it's really important to just make sure you know that in the background of everything else that is going on. And there were certainly happy moments in her life with her family and the people that she loved. So, all right. So we are on to sort of the part of the story you've probably all been waiting for, and you can read this lovely quote here. But unsurprisingly, the Hoover administration lost in the presidential election that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was also campaigning for. They were incredibly unpopular, probably not in small part to Frances Perkins's sort of refuting of the lies that they were telling during the Depression. But FDR became president, and a few weeks before his inauguration, he called Frances Perkins into his office and asked if she would like to be his Secretary of Labor. It seemed like a pretty straightforward ask. She had already been his really closest labor official throughout his stint as governor. So she was kind of the obvious choice, except for, of course, the fact that she was a woman. No other woman had been in a cabinet position before. And she also had some conditions to become Secretary of Labor. So she said that she would only consider it if he would agree to a broad array of social insurance policies, including massive unemployment relief, a giant public works program, minimum wage laws, Social Security program for old age insurance, and the abolition of child labor. So, bit of a tall order. She also had on her list national health insurance. So he knew he wouldn't get her unless he agreed to this. So he consented to her ideas. He said he would back her. She took the night to consider, and she eventually agreed to it. With this happening, her years of public service in New York State were over. However, all of the policies and programs they'd been working on together were now about to be tested for the whole nation, essentially. So with Roosevelt's inauguration, Congress enacted the establishment of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which Roosevelt asked Perkins to implement. He also asked her to present a plan for an emergency relief program, and she delivered a young social worker from New York named Harry Hopkins, who led the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Before Roosevelt presented his famous 100 Days legislation to Congress, the National Industrial Recovery Act, Perkins convinced him to allocate $3.3 billion for public works from the monies appropriated. So a lot of money, especially then. Serving as a member of the Special Board for Public Works, she helped to ensure that this money was specifically used for socially useful projects like schools, roads, highways, housing projects, and post offices. And the public works construction employed as many as 1.5 to 2 million people in 1934. And in 1934, Roosevelt also appointed Frances Perkins to head a committee on economic security. And this was where she forged the blueprint of legislation that would finally eventually become the Social Security Act. So although it doesn't seem like that stuff took very long, because the Social Security Act was passed in 1935 and signed into law in August of 1935, the road was very difficult. I won't go into all of the details, but I do like to highlight it a little bit because, well, first of all, we're going to be experiencing the 90th anniversary of it very soon here. And looking back, Perkins really saw it as her greatest accomplishment. So she, again, was looking to Europe for models of old age pensions. And over in Europe, the government often contributed, but she realized that Americans, and with our culture here, it would be difficult to convince them of a model where they couldn't add to their own accounts. So she studied a different version and ended up coming up with something that would work better over here and be better received. Roosevelt was really the figurehead and the spokesperson to the public throughout this, but she was the one behind the scenes. She found funding for study groups to figure out how this would actually work. She found specifically allies in the cabinet to make sure that it was going to pass through the various leaders, all the connections she had to make, and she also needed to make sure it was constitutionally airtight. So she would have to also rally support for Congress to pass it. And yes, it did eventually pass, of course, and went into effect immediately when it was signed in August of 1935. There are, of course, flaws. It was not an immediate fix to everything. One of the flaws was that the old age pension in particular didn't include agricultural and domestic workers at the time. So this excluded a lot of Black and Hispanic workers in particular. And the unemployment insurance was a state-federal collaboration. So this meant that some states could kind of minimize their programs. So a lot of changes, of course, would happen afterwards. Another flaw was that she actually wasn't included under Social Security. There were certain state officials who were not included as part of a compromise. So she would not be able to avail of the benefits. And she would actually end up pretty much working her whole life. So the irony of that is kind of devastating. However, despite its flaws, it was really sort of one of the hugest, if not the biggest, pieces of socioeconomic legislation to directly uplift people from poverty. And she had done it as the first woman in this position, as the first woman in the cabinet in less than 3 years of being in this position. So there is a photo of the signing. And again, she is the only woman there. So pretty monumental moment in history. So despite all of that, Perkins still had a really difficult relationship with the press and her fellow politicians. They still claimed, as they had been claiming, that she really was not doing enough. As you can imagine, her becoming Secretary of Labor met with a lot of backlash. But despite all of the things she accomplished, they didn't really let up. Even in 1938, she played such a vital role in securing other worker protections that we have today. Congress enacted the Fair Labor Standards Act, establishing a minimum wage and maximum work hours and certain bans on child labor. So these were other things that were on her list that were getting ticked off. But this made her more unpopular with some people, particularly business leaders. And even within the cabinet itself, she never really felt quite at ease. She made certain allies, Harold Ickes, for example, but I don't think she ever felt like any of them entirely had her back. And you can see here the photos of her sort of being the only woman in the room. It also maybe rubbed the cabinet members the wrong way that Roosevelt seemed to trust her more than anyone at times. She and Harold Ickes remained for the entirety of his presidency on the cabinet, but they were the only two cabinet members to do so. One example of him really trusting her more than anyone is that he actually dispatched her as an intelligence asset during World War II. You would not think that would be part of her job, that would not fall under the job description of Secretary of Labor, but this is something he asked her to do. He specifically wanted her to go to France and perceive or figure out how vulnerable France was to the invasion of Nazi Germany, how strong the French forces really were. And she made herself as unthreatening as possible, sort of using those gender dynamics again, her sort of motherly persona that she would fall into in these situations. She would speak to shopkeepers, farmers on the ground, and get a sense of their knowledge of the French army. And her opinion, as it sometimes was very different to the rest of the cabinet. She believed that they were incredibly vulnerable to German forces. And yes, it was contradictory to everyone else's opinions, but she ended up being correct. There are also other times, especially during this period, the late 1930s, that were just really dark times in American history, and in her history specifically. She, in particular, disagreed also with the government's stance on immigration. And during this time, she was attempting to aid Jewish refugees, particularly children, from Nazi Germany, even before the invasion of Poland and the outbreak across Europe of the war. She was really inspired by the involvement of thousands and thousands of people writing her letters to sort of rally her to use her power and her empathy to save their family members, friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives from concentration camps and death. And at the time, the Labor Department oversaw some immigration policies, so she was doing her best to loosen sort of the xenophobic, anti-Semitic immigration quotas that were in place, and trying to use her power as Secretary of Labor. So she was really in battle with the State Department at this time. They would reject a visa application, and she would do everything she could, go through loopholes to try to get it approved. But this is often a sort of one of the periods in her life where she wasn't successful most of the time. She ended up obtaining about several hundred visas for Jewish children in particular. Of course, this is inherently very tragic because this means that their families were very likely murdered, but she believed that every life counted, and of course, these people probably wouldn't have survived without her. Congress, however, as you can see here in these documents, called for her impeachment in 1939, and the reason they gave was that she refused to deport the labor leader Harry Bridges, who was a union leader and he was a suspected communist. She was eventually exonerated, but she sort of experienced a rapid decline in her reputation, which was already kind of on the fence, just mostly due to her being a woman in this position of power, and also fighting back against certain stances of the cabinet and the wider government. So this was just really challenging period in American history that isn't addressed. The xenophobia that was prevalent in these quotas for immigration, and the impact that they had abroad on refugees who couldn't make it across here to safety. So it was really a defining moment in history, and her work is just one part, but it was really rooted in the belief that government should protect all people. She did get Roosevelt to permit the extension of about 12,000 to 15,000 German and Austrian visas of people who were already here in the United States. And if you want to know more about this story, because it's really just unexplored, this is a book that's come out recently. I really recommend it. It's actually by a previous Frances Perkins Center intern, and it's a wonderful piece of historical research. So, kind of wrapping up a little bit here, at least her story. I'll talk briefly about the Frances Perkins Center a little, but running a little short on time, and I want to be able to answer some questions. So most of the big moments in her career really occurred before World War II, because of course the war sort of took precedence over a lot of these social changes and economic changes that they were trying to implement through legislation. But also, like I said, she was kind of relegated to the outside of the role she had previously taken. And she remained a vital cabinet member, of course, and a trusted advisor of Franklin D. Roosevelt. But her career changed a lot during this time. So FDR died in 1945, and she'd actually tried to hand in her resignation letter a couple of times throughout the presidency due to the pressure, but he had refused. But Truman actually reluctantly accepted her resignation after the death of FDR, and she would go on the next year to write and publish The Roosevelt I Knew, which is a biography about Franklin D. Roosevelt. And she had to keep working. She could not collect Social Security, and she was supporting her family. And she went on to be appointed to the Civil Service Commission, where she stayed until 1953. And then she actually struggled to find employment after this, if you can imagine. She eventually found a place at Cornell University as a lecturer, often talking about her own bills and legislation she had passed. And she stayed there until she passed in May of 1965. And at the end of her career, she really accomplished everything she set out to do, except for national health insurance. So, an incredible person, incredible career. I will very quickly go over, I just want to talk briefly about the National Monument. Here at the Frances Perkins Center, we have owned the house here for about a year. It was acquired from the Perkins family in 2020 from Tomlin Perkins Coggeshall. And they sold it to us. And then last year, former President Biden issued an executive order asking the National Park Service to increase their recognition of women in history. The Frances Perkins Center thought that this site would be an incredible place to do that at. So we campaigned really hard and got local support from leaders and elected officials, and then it eventually became a national monument. It was signed just at the end of last year. So that's very exciting. This is a photograph of some of our local electeds, our main state electeds here on the side, former President Biden, and then that's Tomlin Perkins Coggeshall. He would actually pass a few weeks later after the signing. So we're really happy that he got to be there. And this is it, sort of a comparison. That's our new national monument sign. And yeah, just a fun little before and after picture. We are open to the public, or our barn is specifically. We're doing archival work here in the house, but the barn is open through September. And feel free to look at our website. If you want to learn more about us, go on our social media, and then you can also send me or send us an email at info@francesperkinscenter.org if you think of a question you might have later on that will go directly to me. And I'm very busy, but I'm happy to eventually get back to that. But thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I will pass it back over for some questions. I will stop sharing screen here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary. This was such an incredible presentation, and I personally learned so much. I was like taking notes. So, here's a really interesting question. How did
Yeah.
Frances Perkins get along with Eleanor Roosevelt?
Oh, yeah. So that's actually a question we do get a lot, because people are really curious about these two incredibly powerful women who were in FDR's life. So we don't know a ton, but if you read the book called The Woman Behind the New Deal by Kirsten Downey, it's kind of the definitive biography on Frances Perkins's life. There's a short section on that. It talks about them being kind of more like sisters. They were incredibly close because she was often at the Roosevelts, so they got to know each other very well. They're I don't know that they were necessarily really good friends, but they just were around each other a lot. And unfortunately, since Eleanor Roosevelt wouldn't have been in sort of an official state capacity at that time, there aren't really records of the things that they discussed, what they were talking about. I have to assume, based on their values that we know and the wonderful things that Eleanor Roosevelt went on to do, that they probably would talk a lot about the various things that Frances Perkins was working on and FDR was working on. And they probably shared a lot of ideas there, but that's mostly speculation. So that's really all I know about their relationship, that they did get along. But yeah, weren't necessarily the closest friends, but yeah.
And the book you mentioned was The Woman Behind the New Deal?
Yes, yep,
Okay,
that's
cool, cool.
that's the title of the biography by Kirsten Downey.
So I know you mentioned briefly about her personal life and her marriage. There were happy times and, difficult
Mm-hmm.
times. And she's made some, decisions that were very ahead of her time. But was her husband supportive of her decisions, like her career and like her keeping her maiden name? Or if you could, expand a little bit more upon that?
Yeah, I I don't know entirely. I know that they ran in a lot of the same social circles, and their careers were kind of enmeshed in that way, because not only the same social circles, but of course that would have been kind of their networks through their career and their work and everything. So as far as I know, he was initially supportive of all of this, and I think that was part of the reason they kind of got together in the first place. They were very interested in a lot of the same things. I don't know what his opinions are sort of later. I know I mentioned that sort of brief period in her life where she kind of began to run the household a little bit, and that wasn't really what she wanted for herself. And that was kind of a difficult period in time. So I don't know if I know that was kind of pressured by his career, sort of taking up a lot of time. So I'm not sure if he specifically asked her to do that or something she decided to do. Uh, but he, yeah, unfortunately spent so much of his life in and out of sanitariums and experienced just very, very poor mental health a lot of the time, that I'm not sure what his opinions were later on in life on all of these things.
Mm. And besides Tomlin, if I remember his name correctly, are there any other living descendants of Francis Perkins or
No, Tomlin Perkins Coggeshall was the last direct descendant. Yes.
Mm. And this was a question about the presentation, but what did you say about the getting visas for Germans after the war?
Yes. So this was, I think it was actually, it was either before or during the war. She convinced President Roosevelt to extend the visas of German and Austrian Americans who were already here, so that they would not need to return to such dangerous places. And I think the number was around 12,000 to 15,000 that she was able to extend. Again, compared to the number of people who were murdered in Nazi Germany, that's not a large portion, but uh, it's still, all those lives counted. And she would have wanted to have done more, of course. But yeah, very, very sad story.
Mm. And you mentioned obviously, oftentimes, I mean, most of the time, she was the only woman in the room in her
Mhm.
long career.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific anecdotes about her treatment as a woman throughout her career? Anything that comes to mind, or if you want to expand more upon that?
Yeah, well, I mentioned the press was really, really rough on her. In particular, people in general made a big deal about her keeping her maiden name. That in particular met with a lot of backlash. But I know she had lots of specific interactions, specifically in Albany in the early days when she didn't really know how to navigate those spaces as well, understandably, that specific representatives wouldn't look at her, wouldn't pay attention to her. And at the beginning of her career, there were a lot of labor leaders in particular who just did not believe that she was the right fit for the job. They would sometimes give other reasons besides her being a woman, that she wasn't qualified somehow, despite her experience in New York State. So yeah, I don't have any specific anecdotes off the top of my head, but it's mostly the way not only the people around her, but also the press was just always constantly tearing her apart whenever they could. And yeah, that was, I think, contributed to the reason why she actually tried to quit a couple of times.
Mm.
Just with so much pressure.
Oh, she's a trooper for sure. And I just want to ask a final question to wrap up this presentation.
Yeah,
Do you have a biography? I mean, you mentioned a couple books, but do you have like a best like overarching biography of Perkins or any other books you want to recommend to the audience?
yeah, it definitely it definitely is the best. We call it the definitive biography, "The Woman Behind the New Deal" by Frances Perkins. If you're interested, though, there are definitely other books that sort of explore from different angles. And there's Becoming Madam Secretary by Stephanie Dray is actually a novelization of her life. It's historical fiction, but it's very well grounded in historical fact and research. Like I mentioned, Dear Miss Perkins was a great book if you're looking for more of a focused historical research piece. But other than that, there's a young adult book called Champion of American Workers as well, if you're looking for something for a different audience. And there is also a book called Courage to Meddle. And I'm realizing now, I'm pretty sure actually Frances Perkins is the one who's used the term courage to meddle, but I don't remember the context. That's really bothering me. But there is a book called Courage to Meddle, which is also kind of a biography about her by, his last name is Levitt. So that gives you kind of a list. But if you go to our website under the resources page, there's also plenty of books to peruse and take a look at.
I'll include that link as well.
Yeah, that's
But thank you so much, Mary. This was fantastic. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone for attending. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.